Hi, it's Tom here from Running Physio. Today I'm going to talk to you about Morton's neuroma, and we're going to do a bit of a treatment overview, looking at some of the treatments that are available for this challenging condition. I've also put a link there in the title to our free webinars that you can access on iliotibial band syndrome, lateral hip pain, and also lower back pain in athletes, so do check those out as well. Now, I want to start by saying I'm certainly not an expert in Morton's neuroma. In fact, this is an area where I wanted to learn more about it. It's not possible for us as clinicians to know everything about everything. So when we have gaps in our knowledge, it's a good idea to try and plug those gaps and learn a bit more. So I've gone off, I've looked into the literature, I've chatted to other clinicians, and I thought I'd summarize my findings in this video to you with some of the treatment options that are available to us, both conservative treatment options and what we might consider if those conservative treatment options aren't successful. Now, Morton's neuroma is not really the true term, but it's the most common term used. We think this is actually a compressive neuropathy of the common plantar digital nerve, most commonly affecting the third web space, but can actually affect the other web spaces as well, normally seen in that third web space. And you tend to get this burning, aching sensation in the foot and sometimes spreading down into those third and fourth toes as well. Often aggravated by walking. We think it's associated with footwear, and it's more common in women than men, with some of the research blaming footwear like high heels and very narrow shoes for this. Now, it's a difficult one for us to treat, and I will say from the onset, when I've looked at the literature surrounding it, there's no one treatment that really stands out as a great option, and there's not a great deal of research in this. But we'll explore some of the research and talk about how I might sort of approach this in clinic. And I'd love to hear from you. What do you find really works for people with Morton's neuroma? Now, let's dive into a recent review then and their findings. Now, this is a review by Matthews et al. Published fairly recently that looked at the conservative treatment options, including injections, but not going into the kind of surgical options available for Morton's neuroma. And they've included this nice summary in there of some of the treatment options that are available. Now, they found some evidence to support manipulation and mobilization of the foot as part of our treatment of Morton's neuroma, typically involving treatment to try and improve the range of movement, perhaps involving distraction and plantar flexion of the metatarsophalangeal joints, but mobilization of the other foot and ankle joints if the range of movement is restricted potentially as well. And they found some evidence to support that. Also, they found evidence from meta-analysis of 2 RCTs to support corticosteroid injection, and that led them to this conclusion that corticosteroid injections, manipulation or mobilization are the 2 interventions with the strongest evidence for pain reduction in Morton's neuroma. However, high-quality evidence for a gold standard intervention was not found in this review. They look at other treatment options here, for example, things like footwear changes and metatarsal padding that we're going to look at the moment. Some evidence to support that. There's also various other forms of treatment, things like sclerosing injections, radiofrequency ablation, cryoneurolysis or Botox injections, with some supporting evidence, but mainly from uncontrolled case series. So yet to see real high quality randomized controlled trials in those studies. So it does appear from this recent Matthews et al. Systematic review that the 2 standout treatments in that would appear to be corticosteroid injection or manipulation, mobilization of those foot and ankle joints. However, they also comment that there's a real lack of high quality research here. So I wouldn't assume that those are going to be the go-to options for everyone, but perhaps just reflects the research so far to date. Now, there's also been a nice review paper recently, more of a literature review from Kolo et al. Looking at some of the footwear changes we can make and perhaps some options in terms of orthoses. Now, I like this because often we want to start with simple solutions. Simple things like changing footwear or considering some inserts can often be a go-to before we want to try some of the more kind of invasive measures. So what they recommend in Kolo et al.'s recent paper is that shoes should be sufficiently long, Comfortable, broad toe box. They should have a flat heel and a sufficiently thick external sole that is not excessively flexible. They also mention that a rocker type shoe can be quite effective as an option in people with Morton's neuroma. Now, if we think about some of the kind of things that are thought to irritate this Morton's neuroma, perhaps lead to more compression of that nerve, it is thought to be perhaps extension of the toes that will do that, possibly direct compression from a narrow toe box or from a shoe that's a little bit too small. And there is some theory that perhaps pronation may lead to greater compression of the nerve, although that has been challenged. So it would make sense, some of these footwear suggestions they're making, that it's not too narrow in the toe box, so it's not going to squash the toes, that the shoe's not too small, and that's not going to lead to compression of the nerve. But also that the sole of the shoe is relatively firm, which hopefully should reduce some of the range of movement of toe extension you might need to see during walking or running gait. And we can play around with other things like lacing strategies, perhaps leaving those laces around the forefoot region a little bit looser to allow a bit more movement, a little bit less compression through that forefoot region. And a lot of these things, because we've not got a great deal of evidence, it's going to come down to educated trial and error. If a patient gets symptoms during walking, for example, let's make a couple of changes to their footwear, test it out and see if it helps their symptoms as a simple first-line treatment option. Now, Colo et al. Also mentioned some orthoses that can be used. And again, these tend to be recommended when we chat to other clinicians. So they might suggest something like an orthosis with medial arch support and a retrocapital bar just proximal to the metatarsal heads, and possibly also with a targeted shock absorber insert at the third intermetatarsal space. Now, for me personally, when it comes to orthoses, more complicated orthoses like this, I like to team up with the experts, work with a podiatrist. I recognize this is not really in my skill set. So this is a classic example of a pathology where really you want to be, calling your podiatrist friends, getting them involved perhaps to provide their expert input and look to see what type of orthotic options they can provide. Again, with the aim being to try and reduce some of the stress, some of the compression on that sensitive neural tissue. Kohler et al. Also mentioned the idea of trying to make some custom-made inserts, perhaps to address things like claw deformity or bunching of the toes, which may lead to some more compression of the nerve. So it's about considering different options and working potentially with a podiatrist to see what they can suggest that might really help reduce some of the stress on the sensitive neural tissue. So we talked a little bit about manipulation, perhaps helping to restore range. We talked a little bit about footwear options and orthotics. What else can we offer? Well, going through the research and talking to other clinicians, I've kind of summarized the options in my mind into non-invasive and invasive options. So our non-invasive options would contain potentially manipulation or mobilization. It might involve trying to alter the biomechanics to reduce the stress on that sensitive tissue. So, for example, if we think that there's a large pronation range of movement during running, and that's increasing the stress on the nerve, perhaps that's linked to a narrow stride width, can we change that stride width, get them to run a bit wider, leading to less pronation movement if we think that's relevant to the person? Are they perhaps, in terms of their propulsion, going into a great deal of extension across the toes? Can we try and look at altering their propulsive strategy to see if that helps? Can we look more broadly at load management? So is it simply that they're doing too much of a particular activity, be it walking or running, and that's putting too much stress on the sensitive tissue? We might look at the footwear modification or orthoses, as we've talked about, but also try to address the impairments. Now, the research that I've seen here suggests that loss of ankle dorsiflexion can be an important factor in Morton's neuroma. Now, I haven't seen a lot of high quality evidence to support that, but that might be an example of an impairment that you would want to address. Now, I can reason through in my mind why that may make a difference. So if you're really restricted in ankle dorsiflexion, do you during walking or running gait have an early heel lift? So you lift the heel earlier during the stance phase, you go into extension across the toes quicker and for a longer period, which over thousands of steps potentially increases the stress on that sensitive neural tissue. So I can reason through a little bit of a connection in there, and if then we can try and improve that range of movement, might that lead to a change in their movement pattern with some cueing that leads to less stress potentially on those neural tissues. Now, when it comes to addressing the impairments, personally, I would tend to look at strength, at range of movement, and at movement control. So personally, I would look generally around the foot and ankle to look at the strength factors there, look at the calf, inverters, everters, toe flexors too, potentially. I'd want to look at range, including ankle dorsiflexion, but also neural mobility too. Are they restricted in straight leg raise and slump? And what is their balance like? Are they controlling movements in a way which again might lead to more stress through the forefoot? And we've had an example of this recently with a case in clinic of a walker actually that only really gets pain with long walks. So no symptoms at all with day-to-day activity, no pain with 2 or 2.5 hours of walking, but beyond that distance his symptoms come in. Now he's tried a lot of the measures we've talked about. He's tried the orthoses, he's tried different shoes, he's tried all sorts of things without success. So we've assessed him to see, well, what are the residual impairments here? He's very weak in the calf on that side, and he has reduced neural range with straight leg raise and slump, and a loss of ankle dorsiflexion range, and we're going to work on those impairments to see if it makes a difference. Now, I will say there's a little nugget of doubt in my mind with this approach. Can making someone stronger reduce the stress on that neural tissue? I'm not 100% sure that it can. So it might be in these situations that addressing the impairments is going to be good for function, good for their sport, but I'm still not 100% sure that strength work is going to be the solution in terms of pain. And going through the research, I wasn't able to find any evidence really assessing the effect of improving strength, range of movement, or control in symptoms. So while it might help address the impairments, there's a big question mark as to whether that's actually going to improve symptoms. Still potentially of value though, and particularly in those people that are really impaired in terms of function. Maybe they've really had to scale back their walking or they've stopped their running. If you want to gradually build them back into those activities, it can be helpful to ensure that they've got the strength, range and control to manage those activities. So some good, hopefully non-invasive options there. As we said, manipulation, mobilization, looking at load management and biomechanics, footwear and orthoses, addressing the impairments that you find. But if this isn't effective, if they still have ongoing symptoms, it is worth exploring invasive options. And this might start by looking at steroid injection. Potentially ultrasound guided, up to 3 steroid injections seems to be recommended in some of the research, as there is some evidence we've talked about from Matthews et al. That may help to reduce pain. If that's not effective, we might look to go into more surgical options, such as decompression with neurolysis and translocation. And if that's not effective and there's a recurrence of symptoms, possibly going all the way to open neurectomy with transposition. And these surgical recommendations, then, these are adapted from Jane and Mannon's paper in 2013, which is a really nice overview, actually, of some of the evidence surrounding Morton's neuroma. And interesting from a physio point of view in that paper, that there's a question mark as to whether surgery should be a first-line treatment rather than what we offer when everything else has failed. So there's a lot of question marks surrounding this condition. Personally, I think there's enough there when we look at some of the non-surgical options to try those first and see if they're effective. But if someone's got persistent ongoing symptoms, perhaps if they've got a larger neuroma that's less responsive responsive to treatment, I think we should be open to taking those next steps, perhaps looking at further investigation or going on to steroid injection or surgical consults if we're not getting the results we want. Okay, so there's a whistle-stop tour of Morton's neuroma and some of the recent evidence. As I said, I'm far from an expert in this condition, but I wanted to feed back some of the things I found as I've learned more about it. But I'd really love to hear from you. What do you find effective from this? Are you a podiatrist that's listening in today? What do you tend to use in clinic? I'm sure you've seen lots and lots of cases of these. What seems to be really effective? Let us know in the comments and replies to this. I look forward to reading those. And if you want to learn more about injuries, do check out our free webinars that I've linked to as well. Okay, thanks very much for listening. Bye for now.